said, crucify him, he's to blame. He could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world and set him free. He could have called 10,000 angels, but he died alone for you and me. Upon his precious head they placed a crown of thorns. They laughed and said, behold the King. They struck him and they cursed him and mocked his holy name. All alone he suffered everything. He could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world and set him free. He could have called 10,000 angels, but he died alone for you and me. To the howling mob he yielded, he did not for mercy cry. The cross of shame he took alone, and when he cried it's finished, he gave himself to die. Salvation's wondrous plan was done. He could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world and set him free. He could have called 10,000 angels, but he died alone for you and me. You may be seated.
Good morning, church. So glad to see you all here today. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you all, everybody who's with us online as well. Hope that today is encouraging for you all. Want to say especially thank you and welcome to all of our visitors today. Today we don't have any note sheets, and I think you'll see why as we go through the sermon. It's just not the type of sermon that is conducive for note sheets or honestly even the PowerPoint. So we're going through a story today, and sometimes it's hard to figure out how to make a note sheet for a story. So that's why we don't have any of those today. I want to remind you, next Sunday is Easter. We're going to be celebrating the resurrection of Jesus in a special way. Obviously, every Sunday we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus, but Easter Sunday is a special time for us to do that. So next week we're going to have an Easter sunrise service that will start at 7 a.m. That should allow us to catch the sunrise if we could see it over here, but sometime around then. So we'll be over here probably in this around the cross over here in the field next Sunday morning, 7 a.m. for an Easter rise service, and then we'll have coffee and donuts together between class and church for the first time in over a year. That's going to be so much fun. So last year, at the beginning of 2020, I started on a series through the Gospel of Mark. And now we're getting right down to the very end. And next week is obviously the Resurrection Sunday. And next week, we're going to finish up the Gospel of Mark in Mark chapter 16, talking about the resurrection of Jesus. And so this week, we have a lot of ground to cover in Mark 14 and 15. We're not going to do a verse-by-verse study of everything there, but we are going to tell the story of Jesus as we go through this section. It's a beautiful story. It reminds me of a song. As I was preparing this lesson, thinking about it all week long, this song came to my mind over and over. I'm not going to sing the song for you. I'm going to read it to you, though. Oh, I know you're disappointed, but people online will be glad that they're not just going to hear me singing by myself. But let me read this to you. This is My Jesus, I Love Thee, number 701, if you want to read along. My Jesus, I love Thee, I know Thou art mine. For Thee all the follies of sin I resign. My gracious Redeemer, my Savior art Thou. If ever I love Thee, my Jesus, 'tis now. I love Thee because Thou hast first loved me and purchased my pardon on Calvary's tree. I love Thee for wearing the thorns on Thy brow. If ever I love Thee, my Jesus, 'tis now. In mansions of glory and endless delight, I'll ever adore Thee in heaven so bright. I'll sing with the glittering crown on my brow. If ever I love Thee, my Jesus, 'tis now. Jesus is the most lovable person to ever exist. He is the most beautiful person to ever exist. Because He is the exact representation, the exact image of God, He is both of those things, the most lovable and the most beautiful. And this is seen so clearly in these last few hours of His life. We're going to pick up in Mark 14, where we're looking at the night before His crucifixion and on into His crucifixion, up until His burial. This is the time frame for our lesson today. The right after the Passover meal that happened the night before His crucifixion, all the way through His burial. And what we're going to see is that Jesus maintained His character perfectly in the most stressful moments of His life. We could probably say the most stressful moments in all of human history, and Jesus didn't bend an inch. He was perfectly true to His character through those hours. And He was such a beautiful person in that time. And so today is just going to be a meditation on who He is and how He progressed through those extremely stressful hours, through that ordeal. The character He displayed here, this is what is amazing to me. And there's probably going to be a lot more verses that you'll be able to see this than I'm picking out today. But what you're going to see is the character that Jesus displayed in these last hours of His life shows up over and over again. The other writers of the New Testament keep pointing back, and they were looking at Jesus, and they're writing to different letters to different situations, and whatever different situations, often they'll come back and they'll point out something that Jesus did in these last few hours of His life. They were captivated by who Jesus showed Himself to be throughout His entire life, obviously, but it shows up over and over again in these last few hours. They keep pointing back and saying, that's what He was like, and this is what we learn from it. And now, today we could, each one of these things I'm going to point out today in this story could be a separate lesson, a whole separate sermon where we say, because Jesus did this, therefore we should do this. But today, we're not going to do that. I trust that you can do some of that on your own as you meditate on this over the coming week and month. But what I want to ask us to do today is just hear the story of Jesus again. And as we leave today, be able to say again, Jesus said, if I've ever loved you, it's right now. Just hear the story of Jesus again, and let that lead us to worship and praise and love. So turn with me right now to Mark chapter 14. We'll be continuing down through this text. We're going to begin today in verse 27. Let me read right now a few verses here. Mark 14, beginning in verse 27. You will all fall away, Jesus told them, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. And Peter declared, even if all fall away, I will not. Truly I tell you, Jesus answered, today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And all the others said the same. If we're not careful, we can hear what Jesus says here. You will all fall away. We can hear what Jesus says here through the same cynicism that we bring to our relationships. We might hear Jesus say, I know you're going to fail me because I know what kind of scoundrels you are. That's not what Jesus is saying to His disciples. You know what Jesus is saying? It's not filled with cynicism about who they really were. It's filled with grace and understanding and hope. Watch carefully what He says. He says you'll all fall away, but listen to what He says, why He knows that. He says, for it is written. And then notice what He says. He says, they will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. In other words, what he is saying to his disciples is, he's not getting down on them. This is not anything about how awful they are as people. He's saying, it's actually kind of understandable because something's going to happen to me and you're not going to know what to do with it. And in that trauma of that situation, when your shepherd, am struck down, you're not going to know what to do and you're going to scatter. That's grace and that's understanding. Isn't that so much better than, I don't know what kind of scoundrels you are, you're all going to leave me. That's not what Jesus is saying. He is understanding where they're coming from. Your shepherd, who you've been following every step of the way, he's going to be struck down and you're not going to know what to do. But after I rise, we're going to get together again. Isn't that hope beautiful? That's who Jesus is. Grace, understanding, and hope. Such a beautiful person. As he continues on into the night, he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's going to spend some time in prayer. I want to begin reading right now in verse 32. It says, they went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death, he said to them. Stay here and keep watch. I'm struck by how vulnerable Jesus is. He has no facade to maintain. It's okay for him, the God of the universe, to break down before his disciples and say, I'm overwhelmed with sorrow right now. Isn't that beautiful? What a secure person. He doesn't feel the need to maintain a wall, maintain a front to show them. He's able to say to them, this is hard. And he's just able to be vulnerable with them. What a beautiful person he is showing himself to be in this most difficult moment of his life. And the security is obvious in his prayer. We know that what he is feeling here now, what he is allowing himself to do in front of his disciples, comes from his security in who he is, because this is how it all is placed together in Scripture. So we know the very next thing that he prays as he goes away, he says, Abba, Father. Abba, Father. Everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. But this word Abba, many of us have heard, I'm sure, that Abba is the Aramaic term for father, for like daddy. It's a term that is very reverent, but also very intimate. And so Jesus is speaking to his Father in this deeply intimate yet reverent language, Abba, Father. And now Paul tells us exactly what this is all about. If you look, and this is one of the places where we see it come to fruition, we see the writers of the Gospels coming back later, the writers of the epistles coming back later and pointing to something that happened on these last few hours of Jesus' night of life. In Romans chapter 8, let me read to you what he says here, what Paul says here. And Paul is telling us what this means for us when we say Abba, Father, and therefore we know what it meant for Jesus when he said it. And so this is Romans chapter 8, verse 15. The Spirit you received does not make you slaves so that you live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship, and by him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. And so Jesus, on this last night of his life, the most stressful moment in all of history, when he knew that all of these people, he's asking them to be there with him, he knew in a few short minutes they were all going to abandon him, and he was going to be left alone on this planet, except he's going to have his Father. And he was crying, Abba, Father. And he was living, he was holding on in absolute security to his identity, who he was as God's Son. And so that security allowed him to be vulnerable with his disciples, allowed him to say how he was really feeling in that moment. He didn't have to put on a facade like, no, this isn't hard. He didn't have to act like there wasn't anything difficult about it. He was able to say, my soul is overwhelmed to the point of death. And he was able to do that because he knew he was God's child. Absolute security. And he says, take this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will. The writer of Hebrews writes about this. It's a beautiful passage. Let's turn there to Hebrews chapter 5. Hebrews chapter 5, verses 7 and 8. During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. The writer of Hebrews here is speaking about this moment when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane and he's crying out to the Father, save me from this. If it's possible, let's do this another way. Save me. And the writer of Hebrews says Jesus was heard because of his reverent submission. Reverent is a really important part of that phrase, because what it says is Jesus didn't submit. He didn't just go, well, it's my job and nobody else is going to do it. I'll do it. This wasn't just it's my duty. I guess I better do it. It was reverent submission. In other words, I'll do this because of who you are. Because you're my Father, because I'm your child, because this is your will, I will submit to you. And so Jesus, it was just beautiful, just giving himself over to everything that the Father had in store for him. I trust you is what he was saying. This was not, this is my duty, I'll do it. This is, I trust you. I trust you. I don't know. He knew. I wish there was another way, but I trust you with this way. I will follow you into this. The writer of Isaiah chapter 53, speaks about this in Isaiah 53, verses 10 and 11. And I think this must have also been on Jesus' mind. It says, yet it was the Lord's will to crush him. Jesus knew this was God's will to crush his suffering servant and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. And by his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. And so Jesus was able to reverently submit to this painful way, this way of walking down this incredible suffering. He was able to submit to that because he knew that after this, he would see the light of life. And because he knew that after this, many would come to know the Lord through what he was doing. The writer of Hebrews tells us in Hebrews 12 that it was because Jesus was able to do this for the joy set before him. And what was the joy set before him? As Jesus is sitting here in the garden praying, and he's saying, if there's another way, let's do that, but I'll submit to what you say. Why was he able to do that? Because of the joy set before him. Because he knew that in a few days he was going to be resurrected. He knew that in a few days he was going to be declared with power to be the Son of God. And he knew that through that, the entire world was going to have his chance to come to know the Lord. And many sons were going to be brought to glory. So Jesus reverently submitted. Let's go back to Mark chapter 14. Jesus' arrest. Have you ever noticed who it says came to get Jesus? I'll be honest, in my assumption has always been it was soldiers that came. But look in verse 43. Judas, one of the 12, appeared, and with him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs. In every one of the Gospels, it says it was a crowd that came. That's interesting. What do crowds do? Are crowds typically well disciplined? Not at all. And you put weapons in a crowd's hand against someone that they have told themselves they need to be afraid of. What happens? Things fall apart. And then Jesus, his own disciples, we know from the other Gospels, Jesus' own disciples also had two swords. So you have this volatile situation. And actually, one of Jesus' disciples picks up his sword and begins the attack, which we're told that's Peter. And by the way, Peter said he was willing to die for Jesus. He was. The fact that he denied him later doesn't mean he wasn't willing to die for Jesus. It's just that he was willing to die for Jesus in the way he thought it was supposed to happen. In other words, he was willing to die at the end of a sword, but the way Jesus ended up having it was a little bit different. But that's another lesson. But we have this incredibly volatile situation. Now you tell me, in any other situation in life, you have a group of people who come ready for battle. They're all armed with swords and clubs. And then on the other side, they meet a small group armed with 2 swords. And the small group attacks the big group. What always happens? The small group is destroyed. But Jesus somehow brings calm to the situation. Somehow Jesus, our Lord, steps into this volatile situation and diffuses it all. The most beautiful human being who has ever lived. He did what is practically impossible to do. Incredible. Incredible, is it not? And then he goes before the Sanhedrin. This is the group of Jewish leaders. And they're trying to, it's a mock trial, let's be fair. It's a mock trial. But they're at least trying to cross their T's and dot their I's. That's what they're trying to do. And they're trying to make it look legit. And so they bring witnesses, and the witnesses testify and stuff. And it says that let me just read what they testify. This is in verse 58. So this is what the false witnesses say about Jesus. It says, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands.'" But if you read in John chapter 2, actually what Jesus says is, you destroy, basically. He says, "You destroy this temple, and I will build it again in 3 days." That's what Jesus says. So their testimony is a false testimony. He didn't say, "I will destroy this temple," pointing at the temple. He says, "Destroy this temple, and I will rebuild it in 3 days." And so their testimony was false testimony. It wasn't true. But what does Jesus do with this false testimony? What do I do when someone says something false about me? I guarantee you I'm not silent. When I know that someone is saying something about me that is not true, there's very few times in my life that I've ever not responded in anger or offense or defensiveness. But Jesus sits here and lets them level all of their false accusations against him. And he says nothing. Nothing. It's incredible. It's incredible. It's one of the most beautiful moments of this entire night for Jesus, the pure one, to have false accusations leveled against him. They couldn't find anything true to say about him that was bad, and so they made up things, and he never defends himself at all. He never defends himself at all. In fact, the only thing he ever says is in response to questions about his identity. Did you notice that? The only time he ever responds to them is when they say, "Well, who are you anyway? Are you the Messiah?" And then Jesus will say, "Yes, I'm the Messiah." Before that, he wouldn't say anything. He doesn't respond to their accusations, but he will tell them who he is. And I want you to see that Jesus is in absolute control of this situation. Even when he is in custody, he has been arrested, he is the one that is driving the situation forward. He is the one that is forging his path to the cross. Notice, they have a mock trial. They're trying to cross their T's and dot their I's, and they're trying to make it look legit with testimony and everything. But they can't. It tells us in verse 39 that even the false witnesses' testimony doesn't agree. And so they can't find a way to make the trial look legit. They can't get everything to come together so that the trial looks like, yeah, we can really convict him of something, because their false witnesses can't agree on anything. You notice what Jesus does. He pushes them over the edge. How does he push them over the edge? By claiming his identity fully. Listen to what he says. And so just think about the situation. He is the only one in this situation that is absolutely calm and chill, and they're all gathered around him. They're bringing in their false witnesses. You can see them getting exasperated. Well, they can't get their story straight, and we can't convict this guy if we can't get the story straight. And then Jesus, when they said, "Are you the Messiah or not?" And Jesus says, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Now he's being truthful about who he is. And I think he's pushing them over the edge. He's helping them kill him. He is in control. of the situation. It's beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. So the soldiers take him. Well, he goes to Pilate, and the same thing happens there. They level their accusations against him, and he won't respond. And Pilate says, "Who are you? Are you the king of the Jews?" And he says, "Well, you say so." And that's the only response he gives. And so eventually he is taken by the soldiers, the Roman soldiers, and they begin to mock him. Let me read this passage to you. This is chapter 15, beginning in verse 16. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put on his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. A horrendous scene. The ultimate in degradation. As they're mocking him in every way. They're making fun of him being called a king. They're not really paying homage to him as a king. It's all just in jest. The king of the universe they're treating as an imposter. What does Jesus do in response? Nothing. He doesn't respond to them at all. He absorbs it all. All of their hatred, all of their mocking, everything, all of their blows, he absorbs it in himself. He is the, I hope this analogy is okay, but I think of a black hole where everything comes into it and it exits the universe. So all of their hate, all of their mocking comes to him, and none of it is returned. None of their hatred comes back to them. It's absorbed into himself and taken out of the universe. Isn't that incredible? In 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter's looking back at this night, and he says this: when they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. When he was insulted, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he did not make any threats. Imagine that. What other person who has ultimate power at his disposal and is being beaten by people that are nothing compared to him takes it all and doesn't even make a threat? Doesn't say to them, "You'll see one day who the king is." No implied threats, nothing like that at all. He takes all of their abuse and absorbs it completely. Then they crucified him. And all the people then around him, save his few disciples that have come to watch, everybody else is now berating him. But he continued not to make any threats. He continued to absorb it all. Look in chapter 15, verse 34. At 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now there's one way of reading this passage. When a lot of people think what Jesus is saying here is that God has turned his back on him. And I understand that. I'm not sure that that's what this is saying at all. Because what Jesus is doing here is he's quoting Psalm 22. And if you read, I preached a sermon on this a long time ago, maybe you remember, but if you read Psalm 22, it's not the prayer of a man who thinks God has really abandoned him. Let's look in Psalm 22, and we'll see what Jesus seemed to be having in mind as he said this, as he hung on the cross. Let's look at Psalm 22. So he quotes from the very first verses, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from the cries of my anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest. Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. In you our ancestors put their trust. They trusted, and you delivered them. And so this whole psalm says, what you do, God, is you deliver people who trust you. This is who you are. And so it may feel right now like you have forsaken me, but I know who you are. This is the psalm that Jesus quoted. It may feel like the whole world is gone and you are gone too, and I'm forsaken on this cross, but I know who you are. Listen to what it says here in Psalm 22, beginning in verse 16. Dogs surround me. You can hear Jesus saying this. A pack of villains encircles me. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garments. But you, Lord, do not be far from me. You are my strength. Come quickly to help me. Deliver me from the sword, from my precious life, from the power of the dogs. And then let me finish it with verse 24. For he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. Listen to this. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. And so when Jesus is on the cross and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Every good Jew, and we know Jesus knew this psalm, every good Jew would hear not just the first two verses, they would hear, oh, he has not hidden his face from the afflicted one. And so as Jesus hung on the cross and he has been forsaken by everyone, he is also be able to say to himself and to anybody who had ears to hear, God has not hidden his face from me. God has not hidden his face from me. That's beautiful. That's the kind of Lord we have in the most desperate situation of his life, the most desperate situation in all of history. He was at peace because he knew God had not hidden his face from him. Verse 39 says something quite in chapter 15. Verse 39 says, and when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. You know, a lot of other things happened there. There was an earthquake, the sky darkened, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. A lot of other things were going on there. But what does it say the centurion focused on? Not the darkened sun, not the earthquake, not the veil of the temple. He saw how he died. And the centurion was able to realize normal people don't die like this. This is different. When he saw how he died, he said, well, this is the Son of God. And how did Jesus die? Just like we have been saying. But a man who was treated as a sinner never began to behave like he was treated. He was treated as a sinner on that cross, and he never stooped to acting like a sinner. Why did he do that? Second Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21 says, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. And so Jesus maintained his character. He did not give in one moment to being the person that they were treating him like he was. As he hung on the cross and they berated him as an imposter, as he hung on the cross and they cast every insult they could at him, he never once lowered his standard